Kind of frightening when I first see it. Well, good morning. We'll convene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts here today. We've got a full day ahead of us again here today with the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, and Ministry of Social Services. I'd like to welcome everyone that's here today, certainly committee members, our Deputy Chair, Mr. McMorris, Ms. Lambert, Mr. Weeks, Mr. Fayaz, Mr. O'Lawson, Ms. Mowat as well. I'd like to introduce as well from our Provincial Comptroller's Office, Chris Beta, Assistant Provincial Comptroller, sharp tie, sir. As well, Jen Clark, Director of Director of Financial Management Policy, that's with us here today. I'd also like to introduce our Provincial Auditor, Judy Ferguson, and Trevor St. John, that's at the table here as well. I'll ask the ministry officials that are here today to just, Drew Wilby, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Justice, to introduce who's with them here today, and then we'll turn it over to the Auditor's Office. I should also identify that there's something, our high definition is currently being upgraded, and as a result, today's proceedings are being live streamed online and the Legislative Assembly website, and will be archived and broadcast on the Legislative channel at a later date. So with that, I think we'll get at it. I think we're going to deal with chapters 8 and 10 first within the Ministry of Justice, but I'll turn it over to the Provincial Auditor and her office.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair, members, and government officials. As indicated this morning, we've got several chapters that deal with the Ministry of Justice. Mr. St. John's going to make 4 presentations, combine the first 2 chapters into one presentation because it's linked into the same subject matter. There is only one chapter. It's the chapter 9 on the agenda, contains new recommendations for the committee's consideration. The other ones, the committee has seen that before. The chair has introduced my colleague here. I just want to take a moment and introduce Ms. Kim Lowe, who's our committee liaison and has also joined us this morning. Before we launch into the presentations, I do like to take a minute and extend a thank you to the Assistant Deputy Minister and your team that's with you here today for the cooperation extended to our office during the course of this work. Mr. St. John.
Thank you. So I'll present Chapter 8 and 10 together. So Chapter 8 of our 2017 report, Volume 2, starts on page 55, and Chapter 10 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, starts on page 59. These report the results of our annual integrated audits of the Ministry of Justice, which is now the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General, and it was split into the Ministry of Corrections and Policing. Its agencies and special purpose funds for the years ended March 31st, 2017 and March 31st, 2018. These chapters include no new recommendations for the committee's consideration. We report that the 2016-17 and 17-18 financial statements of the ministry's agencies and special purpose funds are reliable, and they complied with authorities governing their activities related to financial reporting, safeguarding public resources, revenue raising, spending, borrowing, and investing. The ministry and its agencies had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources, except for the noted IT matters. On page 57 of our 2017 report, Volume 2, we recommend the Ministry of Justice prepare and test its disaster recovery plans for its critical information technology systems. At September 2017, this recommendation was partially implemented. The ministry had not tested disaster recovery plans for all of its significant IT systems. We provide an update on this recommendation in our 2018 report, Volume 2, Chapter 10. We report in that chapter that during 2017-18 that the ministry completed its disaster recovery plan and tested the plan in May 2018. Thus, the recommendation is now implemented. On page 58 of our 2017 report, volume 2, we recommend that the Ministry of Justice follow its established procedures for removing unneeded user access to its computer systems and data. By September 2017, this recommendation was partially implemented. The ministry did not consistently follow its procedures for ensuring only authorized individuals have access to its IT systems and data. In our update to this recommendation in 2018 report, volume 2, chapter 10, we report that during that year, we continued to find similar findings. Because of the shared integrated justice services, this is the same recommendation we discussed yesterday with corrections officials. On page 58 of our 2017 report, volume 2, we provide an update on an implemented recommendation. The recommendation was that we recommend the Ministry of Justice consider the benefits in consultation with Saskatchewan's Information and Privacy Commissioner or changes to Saskatchewan's general access and privacy legislation, which could serve to mitigate risks related to the USA Patriot Act. By September 2017, this recommendation had been implemented. The Ministry and the Information Privacy Commissioner identified that a duty to protect personal information was a priority change to the legislation. The proposed changes to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act received royal assent May 17, 2017, and came into force on proclamation. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll flip it over to ADM Wilby for brief remarks, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Firstly, I'd like to pass along regrets from Deputy Minister Glenn Gardner. Unfortunately, he's not able to attend today, and so unfortunately for you, you're stuck with me. I'd like to thank, of course, the provincial auditor for all the work that her and her team do and the great working relationship that we have both with the Ministry of Justice and, of course, as you heard yesterday, with the Ministry of Corrections and Policing. I think we're able to do much better work because of the work that they do and the advice that they provide to us. We do have a number of ministry officials here today. I'll save introductions for when they come up. We'll be sure for them to introduce themselves before speaking for Hansard's sake there. And from there, I guess we'll just turn it right into some comments. I appreciate the comments there, Mr. St. John, on the first chapter. Obviously, this recommendation, as noted by the provincial auditor, relates to disaster recovery plans. As noted, that was implemented, so I won't spend a lot of time on that one today. We'll just sort of breeze past that unless there's questions from the committee. As it relates to the second recommendation on timely removal of user access, of course, you've heard my counterpart, Deputy Minister Larson, speak to that yesterday, and this obviously is a concern across many ministries of government. To recap that, the timely removal of user access matter has been around for some time. It's affected multiple ministries. We've put in quite a bit of work to try to address that, and obviously haven't quite fully implemented the recommendation and achieved that yet. We've made progress towards implementing that recommendation, including this spring, and the Ministry and the Public Service Commission got together to implement a process to automatically receive notification of an expected staff departure so we can adequately prepare for everything that we need to do. Also, in August of 2019, the Ministry modified its processes for removal of user access to ministry-specific IT systems. And we also recently completed an internal test of employees exiting the ministry. The results of the review indicated that both the Information Technology Division and our CGIM system support are doing a good job of removing access in a timely manner when they're advised that the removal is required. And I think that's the key component here, is that they need to be advised of when that removal is required. The issue here lies with the timely notification by ministry staff, and in particular ministry managers, to the Public Service Commission or system administrators of the employee exiting the ministry. So to that end, as you heard from Deputy Minister Larson, a couple of communications have gone out, one in particular to the direct reports of both Deputy Minister Gardner, I would include myself and others, emphasizing the importance of protecting government information. That message was asked to be cascaded down to other officials. And then another communication was sent to executive coordinators, and that's really the heart and soul of our organization. They're the ones that coordinate the work of the executives and others, and I think that's an important piece as well, to make sure that they're aware of the concerns. So to be short, the ministry understands the importance of getting this issue resolved. It's been on the books too long. Our goal is to consider this recommendation fully implemented by the end of the fiscal year if we're able to do so. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Thanks for those remarks and for detailing the actions that have been taken and that will be taken. I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you, and thank you for the opening remarks as well, and for being here today, and to all the officials for being here today as well. So just looking at the financial overview on page 55 of Chapter 8, there's a note about the total revenues of $96.2 million. And this was for 2016-2017, which included revenues that come from fines and fees. And I see that in 2017-2018, that total was $103.8 million. Do we have a figure for 2018-2019?
Unfortunately, Ms. Moore, that's a great question. I haven't brought that information with me, but we can provide that back to the committee and for yourself. That shouldn't take us too long to get.
Thanks.
Just on that, and this will be the same response for any other information that you endeavor to provide, but our committee clerk will provide you the process to make sure that that's where that's sent, and then that becomes part of the record.
Thank you. So because this, the total revenue has increased, was there also a corresponding increase in fees? And if so, when did those increase?
Thanks for the question again. There have been some recent increases in court fees. In particular, in July of 2018, we increased fees associated with provincial court. In February of 2019, we made some further increases to fees associated with Queen's Bench and Court of Appeal. These revenue numbers can change for a variety of reasons. Of course, some associated with fees, some may be associated with revenues and other pieces that are coming through as well.
In this case, did those court fees lead to additional revenues? Do you have a sense of what the additional revenue would have been because of those increases?
Unfortunately, we weren't prepared to answer that at the table today, but again, we can provide some of that information if that's what you're looking for, and we'll provide that through the clerk of the committee.
It would be great to just see a breakdown of the revenue so we can get a sense of what percentage of that is based on increased fees. That's great. On page 57 of Chapter 8, at the bottom of the page, there's a discussion about the Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry and the Ministry of Central Services that includes the disaster recovery services. At this time, it hadn't been implemented, and we see in the status update, and we heard yesterday that there's a relatively robust process now for implementation. Can you explain what some of the delay was in getting implementation?
Certainly. I'll turn this over to Monica Field, who is our Executive Director of Strategic Systems and Innovation.
That was in relation to the disaster recovery. So with the disaster recovery plan, at that time, we were just finishing implementation of the courts side, and we had to basically to prioritize the time between the implementation and doing the disaster recovery. So it just took time between the Ministry of Central Services and our two ministries to be able to coordinate and get that done. It takes a huge amount of resource time, not only the developers and the technical staff within the Ministry of Central Services and their partners, but as well as staff within courts and corrections, and making sure that we didn't impact the business at all during that time.
Thank you. Moving on to Chapter 10 on page 60, when we're looking at the major programs and spending, There's a note that in 2017-2018, the ministry received a special warrant of 10 million. Was there any special warrant funding in 2018-2019?
Thanks again for that question, Ms. Mowat. Unfortunately, the individual to answer most of these questions we didn't bring with us today because we didn't expect to get deep into financials, but well-placed questions, of course. We did receive supplementary estimates in that year. In terms of a special warrant, we will confirm that for you. My recollection is the answer is no, but I don't want to say that definitively. We'll confirm that for sure so that we have an answer for you on that.
Okay, and you don't know the value of the supplementary estimates, though?
Off the top of my head, I don't have it. As I say, I wish we had brought that official with us, but we will confirm to get that back to you. That would be public as part of our estimates book, but we'll find that for you.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is just the pressures on custody, supervision, and rehabilitation services. You can see estimates versus actuals, those not lining up. Have these been accounted for in the budgeting process, and sort of what has that process looked like?
And again, a strong question. As we forecast out, we look to make sure, obviously, that we have the appropriate budget done at the start of each fiscal year, so that we have the appropriate resources and don't have to come back to the taxpayers to ask for more. As was well demonstrated yesterday, we have had changing inmate numbers, of course, across the province, and that leads to the issues of overtime. It leads to issues of new units that have to be opened up on the correction side as well. The counterbalance to that is the court side. Obviously, as things move through the correctional system, we have to move them through the court system as well. So that does lead to some challenges within the ministry. We try to do our due diligence at the start of each year. We've been blessed to get a bit of a rebalance in our budget from Treasury Board and Finance, of course, and through the budgeting process to make our budget whole. And this year, as we commit to going forward, we'll try to make sure that we stay within those means. However, within the correctional system, of course, we can't put out a no vacancy sign. We will take what comes, and from there, of course, we have to clothe, feed, and house those individuals. And so there are costs associated with that. So yes, I would say the due diligence has been done to try to make sure that we have the appropriate budget at the start of the year, and then again to live within our means as the year goes forward. But sometimes we do have to come back and ask for a little bit more.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from committee members? With respect to chapters 8 and 10, I would welcome a motion that would conclude consideration here today. Ms. Lambert moves. All agreed? That's agreed. That's carried. We'll move along to chapter 40, and I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor's office.
Thank you. Chapter 40 of our 2017 report, Volume 2, starts on page 277. This reports the results of our first follow-up of the Ministry of Justice's progress towards addressing recommendations we made in our 2014 audit of its processes to support the provincial court to manage court workloads. The committee has previously considered and agreed to these recommendations. But by July 31st, 2017, the ministry had implemented one of our 6 recommendations and partially implemented the remaining 5. The ministry led a review to update and standardize administrative policies and procedures for use by all court locations. This makes policies and procedures available electronically on a common IT network drive to promote consistency and easy access for staff everywhere. The ministry has also dedicated staff member to review and update policies and documents based on legislative changes, requirements identified by judges, or ideas brought forward by staff to keep staff resources relevant and current. The dedicated staff member discusses proposed changes with court managers prior to implementation to identify impact of the change, receive feedback, and answer questions. The ministry had made progress on The remaining recommendations but have not yet fully developed and implemented a complete forecasting process that identifies administrative and financial resources needed to support the management of court workloads, nor implemented a complete HR plan that includes standardized training processes for staff who support the management of court workloads. The ministry has not yet made its key action plans to address operating pressures related to supporting the management of court workloads public. In addition, it continues to need to improve its collection, analysis, monitoring, and public reporting of information related to supporting the management of court workloads, and define clear and appropriate performance measures and targets for supporting the management of court workloads. Effective support for managing provincial court workloads is important for timely hearings and delivery of justice. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks for that presentation. I'll flip it over to Justice for a response and then open it up for questions.
Thank you for the overview there as well. I'd like to start here by commending our court staff for the work they do. Obviously, they keep our courts functioning. They make sure that that part of the justice system continues to roll, and they have, obviously, as we've talked about here, some significant workloads to deal with. Since the auditor's first follow-up report approximately 2 years ago, the ministry's made significant progress on its process to support the provincial court to manage court workloads. The ministry feels it's now is fully implemented for the 5 outstanding recommendations. The one that remains outstanding, we feel is partially implemented, is the developing and implementing a complete forecasting process. And when the provincial auditor returns for their next follow-up visit in the spring, we're confident that the remaining recommendation will also be fully implemented. And with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And for the work on this front, I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you. Thanks for the initial comments as well. In terms of the partially implemented recommendation, I'm just on the status update that was provided here. There's a discussion about the IT system, budget approval required for a comprehensive IT system. I'm wondering if you can speak to that, if there's an expectation, like, is this something that's ongoing? Is this what system is needed, or is this something that's already being discussed here?
Turn that over to Glenys Bahoon, who's our Executive Director of Court Services.
Good morning. So the IT system is something that a couple other jurisdictions have in place. It's a comprehensive system that not only contemplates integration of financial information, but also all of those core outputs that you might expect to see roaming through the court system. Along with some of those other traditional things, number of court rooms, number of judges, number of clerks. And it takes all of those things along with service delivery measures and integrates them into creating dashboards that's something that you can regularly see by ensuring the data is in there and shift around to allow you to proactively make changes as pressure points or service delivery needs might change. In the interim, we're really pleased to be working on implementing a forecasting model that takes the data that we have readily available to us, which will take us down the road of being able to identify cost drivers. And we've done lots of work on that. We know those traditional components. We know some of our key financial indicators. What we really need to dig into now to be able to do a proactive forecast and how the resources should best be planned for is understanding how much time, if you will, some of those core responsibilities that rest with clerks and supporting the court might take. So we know typically how much time a clerk is required to be in court, for example, and that's somewhere around 50 FTEs. Now we need to dig in and understand how much time do those administrative supports to get ready for court and process things after court take. And we'll do that system, of course, in collaboration with all of our court managers for them to identify their pressure points or their potential savings, so that we can go forward on a regular basis. So we have a plan for the year, and it's something that we're looking at on a monthly basis to be able to make sure that we're being proactive rather than reactive.
Thank you. It certainly sounds like a very useful tool. So I'm correct to understand that you are making it work and figuring out how to meet the spirit of the recommendation, but in an ideal picture, this IT program would make a huge difference in terms of being able to manage court workloads.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. What is the program called?
I don't know the specific name. It's certainly something that our colleagues in Ontario, I would say, are leading in the country as to what really is the desire, I think, for our jurisdictions across the country. It was a program that the Ontario government developed specifically for these purposes.
And is there an understanding of what the cost would be for it?
We don't have a clear understanding of what the cost would be. Some of that may be dependent on how successfully we could negotiate with another jurisdiction and really understand whether our business requirements are close enough to what the Ontario business requirements are to relate to modifications. And at this time, we have not done the assessment to identify the dollars that would be specifically needed for that.
I just, our provincial auditor just wants to offer some clarification as well.
I just want to point out that the recommendation actually didn't call for an IT system, it called for a process. So, it depends, management has flexibility as to how they achieve that. So IT system is a potential solution, but it's not, they can meet the recommendation without an IT system.
Thank you. Going into the chapter a little bit here on page 277, it mentions the fact that there's an 18-month cap for the Jordan decision in provincial courts. So a few years ago, I know we asked written questions, and 3 cases had been dismissed as a result of this decision. Is there an update on how many cases have been dismissed to date?
In terms of that question, we'll double check with public prosecutions to get an answer for that. I know we were up to 7 at one point, but we will confirm that number for you to be sure.
Thank you. It would also be good to know what the charges were in each of these cases.
Definitely commit to getting that for you.
Thank you. On 279, there's an indication that overtime hours have increased. So it says the number of overtime hours worked to support the provincial court in 16-17 was 6,571, which is a slight increase since our 2014 audit, which looked at 6,110 overtime hours. What are these overtime hours for 2017-2018 and 2018-2019?
I have those numbers here with me today. For 2017-18, the overtime hours were 6,887. For 2018-19, the hours were 6,940. What I would offer as well on our overtime hours is, while we haven't yet reached a status quo or frankly a decline in the number of overtime hours, what we are observing is that 2 years ago, the comparisons were almost a 5% increase in our overtime hours. Now we're experiencing less than a 1% increase in our overtime hours. So we really think that we are making significant progress in how we're managing those overtime hours.
Is there a sense of what's driving the overtime costs?
There are a number of things that are going to contribute to our overtime costs. Certainly, some of those things will occur as we have vacancies to staff. We're fortunate enough to have experienced court staff who are long-serving and dedicated employees. That brings with it a fairly high level of leave entitlements. And of course, as court is scheduled, we always have needs to backfill those positions when people are on leave. The other component, of course, is that as the chief judge schedules court and those matters may be held at circuit points that involve travel. Oftentimes the cases are more complex. The clerks are required to be participating at court as long as court is sitting. So we do know that some of it is a natural part of supporting the court in the way we're obligated to do so.
In terms of, so you've mentioned the fact that there's less of an increase now. Do you think that that is due to certain actions that have been taken by the ministry? Like, is there something that you account for making a slight dent in that increase?
There's two things that come quickly to mind for me. One is all of the efforts that we've put into play to create policies and procedures, as well as the judicial officer training manual. Those are really key components so that consistency can be achieved in the processes that are required to do all of the work to support the court. They're also really important to, when you have turnover and you're training new staff, to be able to train them and have them competent and independent in their roles as quickly as possible. So that becomes something I think that's really important. The other area that we've looked at to contribute to those things is really being diligent with how quickly, when we experience vacancies, we're able to move through the staffing process to be able to fill the vacancies. And we've seen our average time to fill a position reduced by, and I don't have the number right in front of me, but reduced by as much as 20 days. And so our vacancies aren't being experienced for the same length of time as they would have been a number of years ago. And I think filling vacancies quickly is also an important factor.
Thank you. On page 281, the ministry has developed a strategic systems and innovation branch with a mandate that includes in-house data analytics. So they were working on centralizing data into a data warehouse by March 2018. Can you provide an update on that?
The table for that one.
We implemented the data warehouse in March. We are continually moving data in as we start to build further reports in that to be able to help support both the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Corrections and Policing.
Thank you. Where is the data warehouse?
The data warehouse is housed within the Ministry of Central Services environment, so the one that they support and house.
Okay. There's also a mention about public reporting on court workloads. Is there an update on that?
Yes, there is. I'm happy to advise that as part of the ministry's 2018-19 annual report, the ministry was able to report on a newly established baseline that speaks to the time for case resolution on a provincial basis. The baseline that was established was through all of the work that was derived out of the data warehouse that is now in place. The number that we are starting from is 259 days. I think it's also important for me to note when we look at that number that we have real opportunities to now do further assessment and analysis to be able to understand what that number stands for, if you will. So there are many factors that contribute to identifying a time to resolution. Those could be as simple as geographically driven, what kinds of technology are available in the various court locations. et cetera. And so the data warehouse has not only allowed us the ability to generate this initial benchmark, but it also gives us the data to be able to do further assessment, to break it down and understand what are the influences on that provincial number and link them to some specific things and initiatives that the ministry has underway to have a positive impact on that.
Thank you. I have no further questions on this chapter, Mr. Chair.
Good questions. Thanks so much for all the work and the answers at the table here today as well. Any other questions on Chapter 40? Then I'd welcome a motion to conclude consideration. Mr. Olison moves. All in favor? That's carried. We'll move along to Chapter 9 at this point, and I'll turn it back over to the Provincial Auditor's Office.
Thank you. Chapter 9 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, starts on page 55. This reports the results of our annual integrated audit of the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General's Victims Fund for the year ended March 31st, 2018. The chapter includes one new recommendation for the committee's consideration. We report that in 2017-18 financial statements of the Victims Fund are reliable and it complied with authorities governing its activities related to financial reporting, safeguarding public resources, revenue raising, spending, borrowing, and investing. On page 58, we make the new recommendation. We recommend the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General Victims Fund submit claims for its federal cost-sharing agreements within the deadlines set out in agreements. For the last few years, the ministry submitted claims to seek reimbursement of allowable expenditures from the federal government much later than the June 30th deadline set out in each of the federal cost-sharing agreements. The federal government does not reimburse the fund for allowable expenditures until it receives claims from the fund. As a result of not submitting final claims promptly, the ministry had not sought reimbursement of allowable expenditures incurred totaling $1.3 million. Not submitting claims promptly results in poor cash management as it delays receipt of cash from the federal government and increases reliance on cash from the provincial government. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks for the presentation. We have a new recommendation before us here in this case. We'd welcome remarks from the ministry, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the auditor for the new chapter. The Provincial Auditor's Office found the fund to have reliable financial statements, of course, which is important, was compliance with various authorities for the year ended March 31st, 2018. We agree with the auditor's finding that the Victims Fund did not submit past claims for federal cost-sharing agreements on a timely basis. We now consider this recommendation fully implemented and have done some work around that to make sure that that continues. Subsequent to year-end, the ministry submitted 2016 and 17-18 final claims for reimbursement. All three 18-19 final claims were submitted for reimbursement by the deadline of June 30th, 2019. So with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. We'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you. On page 55, when we're looking at the 2017-2018 financial results, there's quite a variance between the budget and actual for 2017-2018 in administration costs and bad debt. So there was around 1.9 million budgeted, and the actual was about 3.5 million. Can you explain what this variance, what explains the variance?
We believe that might be attributed to bad debt. We'll get the financial information for you and provide that back to you again as well. I'm sorry, the individual responsible for that, we unfortunately don't have at the table today.
Thank you. On page 57, this is around the recommendation, so submitting claims to seek reimbursement much later than the deadline. I'm just wondering if you can explain, why these delays were occurring.
Sure. In that time period, we had several key staff positions within Victim Services Branch that had been vacant for some time leading up to that point. As well, there was a significant workload, in particular pertaining to the issues and the unfortunate circumstances around the loss and all the work that was put on the folks in the Victim Services Branch and the Victims Fund associated with that, which of course is no excuse, but it's a reason and a rationale. Given those challenges, the Victim Services Branch was required to give victims' needs priority, of course, with the results of the branch delayed submission of some of those federal cost-sharing financial claims. So as a result, we've rectified and resolved those staffing issues, and as well, we've taken a different approach in terms of the oversight of the financial component of that, and we moved that into our central financial group so that they will have oversight of that, making sure that that is their responsibility. So those that are working within the fund can work with victims, work with the administration of that piece, and the financial oversight can be done through our financial folks.
Thank you. I'm noting that the fund has been running annual deficits. Is this something that is expected to continue, is expected to be reconciled at some point?
Good morning, Dwight Lawrence, Director of Victim Services Branch. Thank you for the question, and a couple of factors that come to play that really do ensure that the revenues will allow sustainability of all the programs and services for the Victims Fund. From about 2015-16, there was 10.04 million GRF responsibility moved into the Victims Fund for interpersonal violence and abuse programs. With this spring's budget, that amount moved back into GRF. Another factor was some revenue loss as a result of the Supreme Court decision to strike down the federal victim surcharge. That surcharge has been corrected in the criminal code. It's been amended, and so we'll be collecting federal victim surcharges as well now in the province. And so, the issue has been addressed.
Thank you. Can you speak to how many programs are now receiving support from the Victims Fund?
There's a range of programs and services. The largest component is police-based victim services, about $3.6 million annually. That's a province-wide program based out of police jurisdictions that support victims of crime with crisis immediate response. There's some other components within that, Indigenous resource officers and missing person liaison programs that really focus on missing persons cases. We also fund 10 children exposed to violence programs across the province, 6 Indigenous family violence programs. We have a victims compensation program that pays for actual costs related to a violent crime, and that pays out about this past fiscal $1.1 million. Also have a victim witness program. Victim witness specialists are co-located with Crown. They support children through the process of testifying to manage their fear and anxiety. And then we have 2 restitution programs, and that's really sort of the range of programs and services.
Thank you. That concludes my questions, Mr. Chair.
Good questions. We have a new recommendation here. Do we have any other questions? Well, then at this time, I'd welcome a motion along the lines, Mr. Weeks, that we concur and that we note compliance. Moved by Mr. Weeks, all agreed. That's carried. We'll move along to Chapter 36, and I'll turn it back over to the Auditor's Office.
Thank you. Chapter 36 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, starts on page 249. This reports the results of our third follow-up of the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General's progress towards addressing recommendations we initially made in our 2012 audit related to processes to enforce maintenance payments. The committee has previously considered and agreed to these recommendations. By August 2018, the ministry had partially implemented our 2 remaining recommendations. We found the ministry developed reports to help it better monitor maintenance payers defaulting on support payments. However, the ministry staff was not always reviewing those reports. Not consistently reviewing the reports increases the risk of the ministry not taking appropriate enforcement actions and not determining whether it has accurate and up-to-date information for maintenance payers. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you for the work and the presentation. I'll turn it over to Justice, and we'll go from there.
Thank you again to the Auditor's Office for their work on this file. Enforcement officers work diligently to monitor their assigned client files to ensure appropriate enforcement actions are taken. As the Auditor's report states, the ministries develop reports to help it better monitor maintenance payments defaulting on support payments. The reports are reviewed every 2 months, effective November 2018. Given the number of transaction and client files, these reports take time to review, and of course, in some cases, evidence of the review is not always present. The ministries reminded the maintenance enforcement officers of the importance of document the review of client files. For both outstanding recommendations, the ministry now considers these implemented, and we anticipate working with the Auditor's Office on that to confirm that. With that, we're happy to address any questions the committee may have pertaining to this chapter.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you very much. Certainly an issue that I've seen a lot in my constituency in terms of families trying to get by when maintenance payments aren't coming through. In terms of what happens to the default list and what that process actually looks like, I'm wondering if you could shed some light on how enforcement is realized.
That over to Lionel McNabb, who is our Director of Maintenance Enforcement.
Good morning. Yeah, our collection rate, and thank you to the auditor in their original report, they noted that we had one in Saskatchewan, they noted twice, we have one of the highest collection rates in the country, so thank you for that. And we're using the default rate to monitor payments that we're not getting. So every 2 months they look at a collection rate and see, did Lionel pay last month? I think your question, I'll try to respond to, is what enforcement methods do we have? And that is a wide range of things. Governments over the 26 years since I've been doing this job have been very kind to help us help collect money for children. So I'll just go through some. If somebody isn't paying, the first thing we do is we garnish the federal government, and that would collect any money the person may get from them, including some farm payments, fisheries payments, GST, income tax, employment insurance. Next thing we would do is just automatically our computer system would register their name so they can't buy or sell land in the province. Would also register against personal property so they can't sell vehicles or makes it challenging to buy vehicles. And just to compound that, we register them with the credit bureau so they can't get loans. And then if that isn't working, one of the big ones, of course, we garnish people if we know where they're working. And that's one of our main sources of income. The big hammers then start to come out if they're still not paying, and that is taking away driver's license, canceling their passports, canceling their hunting and fishing licenses, and as last resort is really just taking them to court to try to, in front of a judge, explain why they're not making their payment. So we have a number of methods of collecting, and it's usually quite successful. Unfortunately, there's a number of people that don't work or work under the table, so those are our most challenging ones.
Thank you, and I do appreciate you going through the list as well. On page 249, so this is as of 2018, there were 42 employees and 18 of them were enforcement officers. Is this the same complement that you folks have now?
We now have 2 more enforcement officers, We implemented a new computer system in 2016. As a result of that, we've been able to streamline. We now, each year, last year we collected $48 million. This year we'll collect $50 million for families and children. But the money, with our new computer system, we've got most of our clients on direct deposit, so we issue very few checks anymore. And a lot of the payers that do pay, including the employers, can send us the money electronically. So we don't have to touch as much money. So we took one of our payroll, not payroll people, but that manage the money, and changed that to an officer. And we also had a management position that had been vacant for a couple years, and we made that into a collection officer position as well. So we now have 2 more collection officers.
Thank you. How does that compare to about 5 years ago?
Our staff complement has been fairly steady over the last 5 years. And our file load, to be fair, we get 30 or 40 new files a week, but thank goodness we close 30 or 40 new files a week. So we stay fairly consistent on the files, and the number seems to be around 5 years, whether it's us beating away at people or they've just worked something out, or we even heard people say, well, if you guys have forced me to do it, I might as well just pay. So our caseload is staying fairly stable, as is our number of employees.
So the caseload is something that you are tracking regularly and keeping
That all, we collect collection rate. We get a printout every month on number of files, amount collected. There's a printout that shows how many files each officer has and their collection rate, and that's shared with each officer. We've tried a couple times to say, well, are you sure each of you wants to see what the other people do? And they all go, yes, we want to know because I want to beat Joe. So every month, everybody gets all that information.
What is the average caseload then? How would you describe it?
Our average case, and I'll have to take a step back, because we have an area where once people start paying on a fairly regular basis, even if it's been a long-term garnishment, we move them to what we call a regular payer area. And we just have 2 administration people that look after that. We don't need an enforcement person to do that. For the enforcement officers, our caseload was up around 500 and some files. And with transferring some of the files to regular payer and getting the 2 new officers, we're now getting down around the 350 to 400 range.
Okay. And has that caseload grown quite a bit for enforcement officers? Over the last 5 years, if your staff complement has remained the same, is the demand growing?
Because our caseload is staying fairly stable and we've added more officers, actually, over the last year, the caseload has dropped per officer. It is great, yeah.
And certainly the not having to write the checks probably helps as well, with administrative tasks being streamlined a little bit. Thank you. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Weeks.
Chair, as my experience as MLA has been, I commend your office and the ministry for great work in collections. I've had a number have come through my office and they've been dealt with fairly rapidly. More for informational purposes than anything, how do we have agreements with other provinces for collections, and also international situations? How does that work?
Yes, we do. There's a number of things going on. It's called reciprocity. So reciprocity means we sign an agreement with other countries and jurisdictions. In Canada, we don't need those. We work closely with the other provinces and territories, and the directors of maintenance enforcement have a monthly teleconference to try to make things better. Reciprocity, of course, is with other countries. We sign an agreement. They sign an agreement. As long as they've got some kind of collection system, we will sign an agreement. Saskatchewan has reciprocity with more countries than anywhere else. Right now, there's actually a small working group of deputy ministers and directors, and there's 5 of us on that, including Saskatchewan and our deputy minister, Glenn Gardner. And our task is to try to make it better to get orders faster between jurisdictions and to improve the collection rate on those files. Some of the payers, unfortunately, that move from place to place do it to avoid collection. You can move to BC, and by the time, it takes us a month and a half, 2 months to get it to BC, well, then they move to Alberta. So if we can streamline that, it will also help the collection rate. And last but not least, without taking too much of your time, we have for the 4 western provinces, because they're the ones where people move more frequently back and forth. We actually track a number of the payers, and we call them border jumpers, because they move back and forth. So with Alberta and us, or BC and Saskatchewan, we will all agree to leave all our enforcements in place. So Alberta will have all their enforcements, we'll have all ours, and once in a while we get calls saying, well, you've taken 100% of my income. We say, well, you better come talk to us if you want us to work something out, because you haven't been paying, obviously.
Thank you.
Mr. Morris. Thanks. And I like Mr. Weeks, have a number of these come through my office and have been dealt with very well for the most part. What is maybe I missed it, I'm sorry if I did, but we're one of the best collections in Canada. What is that percentage? Out of however many thousand, how many don't pay?
Let me come at it the other way, because I'm not sure I know the answer to that one, but I do know we collect about 88% of the time. We were up around 91%, and we're down to 88. We took a nosedive around 2008 when the economy, we track the economy. If people aren't working, we can't collect money. In 2008, there was a number, thousands of people actually in the oil industry. A lot of those people had court orders where they had to pay, they made $150,000 a year, $120,000 a year. They no longer have those jobs, but their court order still said they had to pay, $1,500 a month or $2,000 a month. So those are gradually working back through the system. So our collection rate is gradually inching up. And again, we started a program a year ago out of Family Justice Services, which is part of what I look after, a recalculation program. So we started that a year ago to help people change their court order. We have in the last 8 months changed about 75 court orders, and about half up, half down. So it works both ways. If people give us their income tax information, we can change it. If they don't give us the income information, and mainly those are the ones going up, we have the ability to contact the employer and say, what does Lionel make? And then based on that, we'll move that up. So people don't have to go to court to do that, and the cost is free.
Great.
Ms. Lambert.
Thank you. You mentioned suspending driver's licenses, and I would imagine that would get someone's attention pretty quick. But how does that work when it comes to their employment? If you're hindering them from getting to and from work without a license, or the public transportation doesn't work for them, how do you?
That question quite regularly.
Okay.
Well, I guess my response is, well, if you're going to work, why aren't you paying?
No exception made for getting to and from their employment. All right.
If they tell us where they're working,
yes,
get the money. Trust
got
me.
It.
There's the odd exception where we'll say, I'm out of work, lost my license. So our response on that is, we'll give your license back for a month. Go find work as long as you let us know where it's working. And we also have in our legislation that if we make an arrangement with somebody and give their license back, if they don't follow through on that agreement, we can pull it immediately. So we do try to work with people, but if they're working, they should be paying.
Thank you.
So thanks so much for the work on this front and all the work on the recommendations here today as well. Just that 88% collection rate, does that include, is that a reflection of the regular payers, or does the 88% include the activities that you go out to collect the dollars from those payments that are outstanding as well?
The 88% includes the people that pay regularly, but it also includes about 2 or 3% of our files where the payer is on social assistance and we don't get anything. So to some extent, it averages out a little bit because we put everybody in the mix. So if the payments are coming in, like all we can look at is what should have been collected in a year and what we collect. So to some extent, I think maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. But just to clarify, because you're working hard for the very important work if somebody's not paying and you're going out to get those dollars, and that would, but they maybe hadn't paid for a number of months or something at that point, and then those dollars, once they're collected, that would be included in your collection rate. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I guess obviously for those that are expecting those payments and counting on those dollars to live their life and raise a family, any breach of that monthly payment can be a real challenge for them. Do you keep track of what the regular payment rate is as opposed to the collection rate?
Our system doesn't track that exactly. I suspect the number is less than the 88%. It's likely in the 78%.
Thanks again for your important work on this front. It's important to many, and as others have said, this is certainly something that we work with in our offices, and it's pretty critical that if someone's to go a month without a payment is hard. So extend that out over any period of time, and it puts people in a real hard position. So thanks for the work to your entire team.
I guess my last comment would be, because we get so many calls from MLA's offices and MPs that a number of years ago we built into our legislation that MLAs or MPs, can just phone us directly, but they do not, as long as they've talked to the person, it could be the payer or the custodial parent, they don't have to get the waiver signed. So we built that in just to make it easier, and so a good chunk of MLAs and MPs just phone my office directly, and we will be back. We get back to them usually within 4 to 6 hours.
So just to say, that's really appreciated. We don't need to share the direct contact at this table right now, but if there could be a note sent out to that would go out in essence as a little memo to all MLAs as to where that contact would be placed, that'd be really helpful for everyone's offices.
There's been a number. We'll gladly do that, but ministers over the last 25 years, we've likely sent out 7 or 8 letters, and we will gladly do one. So all ministers have agreed to that. We'll get one shipped out.
That's great, and make sure it gets out to all MLAs if possible.
All MLAs and
Thank you so
MPs,
very much.
yeah.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, well, thank you for the work here. Not seeing any other questions at this time, and these 2 recommendations are outstanding and implemented. I would welcome a motion that concludes consideration. Mr. Olawson moves. All agreed? That's carried. That we conclude consideration of Chapter 36. At this time, I'd like to thank justice officials that are here today for their time and their attention and their answers here today, and certainly to all those that aren't here that have been involved in this very important work. Thank you to them as well. So any closing remarks at all from ADM Wilby?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd just like to thank the committee for having us here. Of course, thank the Auditor's Office again for all the work they do. Thank you for the questions, Ms. Mode in particular, for your very thoughtful questions, and we have some information to get back to you on, and we'll do that. I'd like to thank our officials that are here and prepared all the work for today and spoke at the committee as well. So again, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. We'll take a brief recess. We've moved our schedule along, and we have the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training coming along soon. So I guess to committee members, be near when they're here. We'll go at it. We'll reconvene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts here this morning. Thank you so very much to officials with the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training for doing a bit of a hurry-up offense to join us here today. We were ahead of schedule, so thank you for accommodating us and the hearing that we have. Thank you to Deputy Minister McFadden and the officials that are with us here today. I would welcome him to briefly introduce the officials that are with him, and then we'll turn it over to the auditor to deal with chapters 19 and 30 bundled together first, and then we'll have remarks from the ministry at that point. So at this point in time, I'll turn it over to DM McFadden.
Thanks for the opportunity to introduce a couple of members of our leadership team in the ministry. At my right is Ms. Krista Ross. She's the Assistant Deputy Minister for Immigration, Employment, and Career Development. That's the division in the ministry that helps workers to prepare for jobs, get jobs, and stay employed in this province. That includes workers from inside the country and outside. And at my left, your right, is our Chief Financial Officer, Denise Hawes. Her team in corporate services manages corporate support for the Ministries of Immigration and Career Training, Energy and Resources, and Trade and Export Development.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to table PAC 9028, Ministry of Immigration and Career Training Status Update dated September 26, 2019. I want to thank the officials and all those involved in putting together that status update as well. That's really helpful for committee members to focus our questions. I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor and her office to respond or to present on chapters 19 and 30.
Thank you very much, Chair, Deputy Chair, members, and officials. I'd just like to introduce my colleague that's to my left here, Mr. Kelly Dice. Kelly is the Deputy responsible for a portfolio that includes this immigration career training. Behind is Mr. Victor Schwab. Victor led some of the work that's on the agenda here this morning, and Ms. Kim Lowe is our committee liaison. I just want to take a moment and pause in terms of how we're going to present the chapters that are on the agenda. We're going to package the first two together into one presentation. And then Chapter 4 of our 2016 Volume 2 will be on its own. Then we're going to package the next two chapters, the 2017 Volume 1, Chapter 3, and 2019 Volume 1, Chapter 31. And then the last two chapters, again, will be packaged together in the same presentation, like a separate presentation. So there'll be 4 presentations that Mr. Dice will be making here. So before I turn it over to Mr. Dice, I just want to take a moment and extend thank you to the ministry for the cooperation extended to our office during the course of this work. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Good morning. The Ministry of Immigration and Career Trainings, and that's formerly the Ministry of the Economy, works with Saskatchewan employers and potential immigrants to improve the likelihood of the federal government accepting a nomination, that is, a recommendation. The ministry uses the program to recommend, that is, nominate, applicants who qualify under provincially established criteria for permanent immigrant status to the federal government. Chapter 19 of our 2016 report, Volume 1, on pages 237 to 242, reports the results of our first follow-up of the recommendations originally made in our 2013 audit of the ministry's processes to nominate qualified immigrant applicants to meet the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program's needs. Chapter 30 of our 2019 report, Volume 1, on pages 297 to 299, reports the results of our second follow-up. By March 2016, the ministry had implemented 3 of the 5 recommendations. The ministry had followed its policies and procedures to document how decisions were reached on eligibility and qualifications of immigrant applications. It had also established a process to estimate and communicate future processing times for its programs and updated its policies to reflect its risk-based practice for quality reviews for the program. By February 2019, it had implemented the 2 other recommendations. The ministry has provided guidance and training for staff to assess the business establishment plans for the entrepreneur immigration categories of the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program. In this chapter, we note the ministry no longer requires applicants to submit relocation and settlement plans. Therefore, this part of the recommendations are considered no longer relevant. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much for the focus and the presentation. I'll turn it over for a brief remark if the ministry, if the DM cares to, and then otherwise we'll open it up for questions.
I think, as Kelly's noted, the SINP program continues to evolve over time, and we're pleased with the observations that have been made on the improvements to our practices.
Thank you very much. Committee members, questions? Ms. Mowat.
Thank you, and thank you for providing the status updates as well. When we're looking at page 238 of Chapter 19, there is Figure 1, applications received and nominations by calendar year. So it's providing us a bit of an overview of how many applications have been received and how many nominations have been issued. But it only goes up to 2015. So I'm wondering if you can fill us in on what these figures were for 16, 17, 18, whatever the most recent available information is for applications received, nominations issued, and what the federal limit was in those years.
That's something that will need to be tabled after because we did not bring all of that up-to-date information. I can tell you that since 2015, we've seen increases to the federal allocation for nominations available to the province. Those are done on a calendar year basis, which is why you see the chart displayed as it is. For the current calendar year for 2019, the province has an opportunity to nominate up to 6,000 individuals. And then when that's combined with family members, including spouses and children, we expect a bit of a multiplier effect on the landings that will take place in future years.
Okay, thank you. Is that something that you could provide back to the committee, those updated numbers? Okay.
And thanks so much for that undertaking. We'll make sure that the committee clerk connects with the proper way to, the channel to get that, to make sure it's part of the record. Thank you.
On page 239, there's a note that as of March 2016, about 4 ministry staff were responsible for evaluating applications in the entrepreneur category. How many staff are responsible for this work today?
Question. Sorry, I was just going online to confirm with our director the number of current employees we have in our entrepreneur unit, as we refer to it. So we currently have 4 business immigration officers. We have 2 what we call information verification analysts. So the information verification analysts are the one who would do sort of an initial review of the file to make sure it's a complete application and we have all the information that is required. And then it would proceed to a business immigration officer who would actually be reviewing the information and assessing it against the program criteria and making a recommendation as to whether or not it meets program criteria.
Thank you. So that would mean you would have 6 staff total that are responsible for work within the category?
Well, I mentioned, I guess, the full team complement. So we do have a director that's responsible specifically for our business immigration, so entrepreneur and farm. There's also a manager of that team. We have a dedicated administrative assistant in that team. And we have another position, another individual. We refer to her title as the business landing officer. So she's the one that works with applicants more on the back end. So mostly right now with our former applicants who were under the old criteria where they would submit an application, they would have a business proposal, they would be approved for a nomination at the front end, and they would be arriving to Saskatchewan as a permanent resident, and then they had 2 years to fulfill the terms of their business agreement with us. So her role is to basically work with the nominees once they're requesting a return of their $75,000 good faith deposit, which again, I'm talking about all old program requirements and criteria. But after they've landed, after they've established their business, after they feel or consider themselves to have fulfilled the requirements of their business performance agreement with us, she would be working with them to verify that, in fact, they have met those requirements and that they would be eligible to receive their $75,000 good faith deposit back.
Thank you. And what is the fee structure like for new programs in this category?
So do you mean kind of how the program works or how the work is divided amongst the staff I just mentioned?
The fees.
Okay, so it's a totally different program. There isn't a $75,000 deposit. There isn't any kind of good faith deposit. What's required now is they're still required to apply and provide a business proposal. If they're approved, what they get at that point is just support from us to get a temporary work permit, which allows them to come to Saskatchewan as a temporary resident to set up their business. And then once they've fulfilled the terms of their business performance agreement, then they can apply to us to receive the nomination for permanent residency. So we found that the good faith deposit wasn't perhaps the right incentive or wasn't helping us to achieve the outcomes we wanted. So now we've moved to what we call a two-step model where, we're at the first cut or at the first stage, we're supporting them to come here as temporary residents to start their business and carry out the plans in their business proposal. And then once they've done that, that's when we will give them the support to become a permanent resident, so nominate them for permanent residency.
Thank you. So you went from the $7,500 deposit to basically there's no fee.
So it was a $75,000 deposit, and there's an application fee, but there isn't any financial deposit that they have to put advance to us.
What is the application fee?
It's $2,500 to apply.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that application fee is non-refundable regardless of what happens with the application?
That's correct.
Okay. What has the revenue stream looked like from the applications?
Our fee structure within the SINP is designed to be cost neutral. We're trying to recover the costs that are necessary to operate the program. So we're not running it as a profit center by any stretch. So we will calibrate and calculate those costs and update the registration fees as needed.
That concludes my questions on these chapters, Mr. Chair. It's good to see the recommendations implemented, and thanks for the update.
Yeah, thanks so much for the detail in the status update as well. With respect to the implementation, there's a lot of work that's detailed there. Other questions from committee members? Not seeing any at this. Oh, sorry, Ms. Lambert.
Thank you. So you had mentioned the figure 6,000 that were allowed by the federal government to process. That's annually?
We receive an allocation on an annual basis. Hopefully it's before January 1st, but at times it's later. And it has grown since 2012. And so we've seen an increased opportunity to attract people as entrepreneurs, farm owners, and workers in this province.
Based on your last figures or your latest figures, how many applications would you receive versus how many were allowed to accept?
There is significant interest in people moving to Canada, and the program is meant to respond specifically to the economic demand and the unmet need for skilled labor in the province, primarily. So the program sees people nominated with job offers, some people nominated because their skills and experience align with the forecast of labor market opportunities and the economic trends in Saskatchewan. So it's going to vary by sector, it's going to vary by industry. And so we very carefully calibrate the policy so that we are not oversupplying, but that we're getting just the right volume of skilled workers that Saskatchewan requires.
But you receive considerable more applications than you're able to process it and accept based on that 6,000 ceiling.
Correct.
Thanks so much. At this time, I'd welcome a motion to conclude consideration of chapters 19 and 30. Ms. Lambert, all agreed? That's carried. We'll move ahead, and we're going to focus, I think, on chapter 4 by itself because there's new recommendations there. All right, I'll turn it over to the auditor's office.
Chapter 4 of our 2016 report, Volume 2, on page 25 to 28, reports the results of our annual integrated audit of the Ministry of the Economy, now the Ministry of Energy and Resources, the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, and the Ministry of Trade and Export Development for the year ended March 31st, 2016. On March 31st, 2016, the Ministry had effective financial-related controls and complied with financial-related authorities other than the following area. On page 28, we recommended that the Ministry of the Economy follow its established procedures for removing user access to its computer systems and data. We noted 5 out of 5 instances where the Ministry had not removed both the user's MIDAS and network access promptly. In addition, we found 3 more employees that did not have network access removed promptly. We note that this recommendation has now been implemented as reported in our 2019, or in our Chapter 19 of our 2017 report, Volume 2. That's in the summary of implemented recommendations. On page 28, we also report that the ministry successfully implemented the recommendation related to its new oil and gas system. During 2015-16, it developed a plan to measure and report on the benefits of the Process Renewal Infrastructure Management Enhancements Project, the PRIME project. That concludes our presentation.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll turn it over to the Deputy Minister, and we'll go from there.
I think we're pleased to report some progress in these areas, and Denise Hawes is able to speak to some of the successes that have been made within the ministry's work with energy and resources, trade and export development, ICT, but also progress across government that's been made in this same area.
Okay. Do you want questions, or you want me to add on to that right now? I would just add one thing, that over and above the status update, the information on the removing users promptly, there now is a new process across government where upon termination and a notice goes into the PSC, that there's an automatic notification that goes over to ITD now to have that access removed. And so I think it's much smoother all across government, and part of that shows in that this audit itself was from 3 years ago, and we haven't had that issue occur again. So.
Thank you. I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you. Thanks for the initial update as well. As I'm looking at Chapter 4, I see that there were 576.9 FTE employees when this report was written. So this was from 2016. I'm wondering how that compares to today, because it's split across ministries, which is sometimes can make it a little more difficult to compare to the past.
No. What I would say to that is when the ministry was split into 3, the FTEs were aligned by the role that they played into each of the 3 ministries. With that split, the corporate services area and even marketing and communications, like those corporate type areas, continue to provide. We have an actual official memorandum of understanding that we've signed, where we continue to provide the shared services to all 3 ministries. So there wasn't a large change in the numbers of FTEs. There was some minor change in that we then had to form 3 deputy ministers' offices and those kinds of things. So there was a bit of a change in FTEs, but overall, the number of FTEs at the time of the split was, I think we might have added 3 across, maybe 4 at the time of the split. Otherwise, it stayed the total stayed the same across the 3.
Thank you. So you don't have the exact number with you, I assume?
No.
Okay. On page 26, Figure 1 shows a significant amount of variance when we're talking about estimated versus actual revenue streams. I won't go through all of the differences, but it is significantly different in terms of the total revenue that was forecast. Can you speak to whether 2015, 2016 is a unique year, or if this is common?
Thank you for the question. with the split into the three ministries, by far the vast majority, if not almost all of this revenue, is resource-based revenue, which is now in Energy and Resources and managed by that ministry. So unfortunately, I don't have any of those figures or anything. What I would say is a lot of the forecasts are very dependent and reliant on the commodity prices, depending on which commodity it is, the status or the state of the industry, and what that is. So the forecast to actuals can vary from one year to the next, depending on, you know, if there's a major incident in the industry, if there's a huge potash mine that has to shut down because of flooding, for instance, or whatever. There can be large variances from year to year on what the forecast is and even what the actuals are. But I'm sorry, I don't have those numbers.
Is there, so does it have a significant impact on ministry operations then, to see a significant change in the actual revenues?
Can you define for me what you mean by impact on ministry operations?
The programs you're available to provide. So obviously the revenue comes through Energy and Resources, but there are programs that need to be provided through Immigration and Career Training as well. So
the revenue that comes in goes into the general revenue fund, and the budget process in government then takes in account how much revenue there's going to be, whether it's this type of revenue or taxes or whatever. And then the budget process is then what aligns what the budget of each of the three ministries is. So in that budget process, Treasury Board takes into a lot of considerations. Obviously, resource revenue is part of that because it's a lot of revenue, but there's other tax revenues in that as well. So yes, but it's through the budget process.
If I could just add, and speaking maybe to the intent of your question, in terms of revenue that supports the activities in the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, the province has federal provincial labor market transfer agreements with the Government of Canada. There's two major ones. Since the time of this audit and the table that you see here, we've seen increased federal investment in Saskatchewan's labor force. And so it does allow us to extend the reach of our programs and services to build the labor supply.
thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from folks around the table? Not seeing any. I guess we do have a new recommendation, and implementation has occurred in this case. And thanks for the detail on that as well and all the work that would have gone into it. So I'd welcome a motion to concur with recommendation number 1 and note compliance. Mr. Olawson moves. All agreed? That's carried. We'll move along to we're going to deal with the next two chapters together, Chapter 3, Chapter 31, from the 2017 and 2019 reports, respectively, both Volume 1s. I'll turn it over to the Auditor's Office.
The Ministry of Immigration and Career Trainings, again, formerly from the Ministry of the Economy, is responsible for increasing employment opportunities for Saskatchewan people. In 2015-16, the ministry started to use a form of outcome-based contracts for its labor force programs, such as the Adult Basic Education, Essential Skills for the Workplace program, ESWIP, if you will, and the training programs for unemployed and underemployed with the objective of increasing their employability. The ministry budgeted $2.3 million for ESWIP outcomes-based contracts in 2016-17. In 2015-16, the ministry spent $1.7 million under outcomes-based contracts. Chapter 3 of our 2017 report, Volume 1, on pages 25 to 40, reports the results of our audit of the ministry's processes for establishing outcomes-based contracts for the delivery of adult basic education, essential skills for the workplace program. We found that the ministry had other than the 3 areas reflected in our recommendations, effective processes. I'll focus my presentation on these recommendations. On page 35, we recommended that the ministry use clearly defined and measurable outcomes to know whether quantifiable improvements are made for program participants, clients, if you will. Well, for each of the contracts we tested, for its essential skills for the workplace program, the contract clearly set out the agreed-upon outcomes and performance measures that aligned with those included in the ministry's listings. Some of these outcomes were not measurable. We recognize that not all measures can be quantitative, and at times qualitative measures may need to be used. However, those measures need to be clearly defined and have agreed-upon methods to determine whether the outcomes have been met. Without consistent use of measurable outcomes, the ministry cannot know whether using outcomes-based contracts is making quantifiable improvements for participants. Therefore, the ministry cannot know if its essential skills for the workplace program improve participants' employability. On page 37, we recommended that the ministry reconsider the use of financial incentives in its outcomes-based contracting. The form of outcomes-based contracting the ministry used did not link the amounts paid to the suppliers to the achievement of outcomes specified in the individual essential skills for the workplace programs contracts. Rather, like conventional service contracts, it based payments under the essential skills for the workplace program contracts on its receipt of required reports that set out services delivered. Incentives can provide suppliers with additional motivation to achieve agreed-upon outcomes and can generate supplier interest in participating in a program. Without including incentives in its essential skills for the workplace contracts, the ministry is at risk of not meeting its objectives for its longer-term use of outcomes-based contracting. On page 38, we recommended that the ministry align contracted terms of payment with the supplier's achievement of outcomes for its outcomes-based contracting. Under its outcomes-based contract management process, the agreed-upon outcomes in a contract are to reflect the minimum performance the ministry will accept from a supplier. While a supplier may not achieve all of the agreed-upon outcomes, not linking amounts paid under essential skills for the workplace program contracts to the achievement of at least a portion of those agreed-upon outcomes seems contrary to the ministry's objective of using outcomes-based contracting and to defining features of outcomes-based contracting. Not adequately designing payment provisions at an appropriate level increases the risk of suppliers not coming forward to provide desired services or the ministry not achieving agreed-upon outcomes. Chapter 31 of our 2019 report, Volume 1, on pages 301 to 304, reports the results of our first follow-up of these recommendations. We found the ministry had implemented one of the 3 recommendations. The ministry revised its contracts to make contracted outcomes clearly defined and measurable. However, the ministry has not further assessed the use of financial incentives in its outcomes-based contracts and has not aligned the contracted terms of payment with the achievement of outcomes. And that's our presentation.
Thanks for the presentation and the work. These 2 chapters come together in 31, and you've done a good job detailing the actions here, so thank you very much. Some brief remarks before we get to questions. Okay.
Happy to take questions.
All right. Questions? Ms. Mowat?
Thank you. One of the biggest questions I have is something I'm not very clear on. So in chapter 31, right at the beginning in the main points, the auditor notes that the ministry has not made progress in using financial incentives nor aligning payment terms to the achievement of outcomes. And then this is also discussed at length in chapter 3, I think on page 36. where it talks about setting a payment structure to attract service providers and foster achievement of desired outcomes. The ministry decided not to use financial incentives at this stage of its use of outcomes-based contracting. So before we received the status updates, that was my understanding. And then in the status update, it indicates that financial incentives are already in place when it's talking about the use of financial incentives in outcomes-based contracting. So it says financial incentives are already in place for good performance, such as contract renewals and opportunity for projects to transition to multi-year funding. So I'm just not clear about if something has changed since this report. So I think this would have been out in June. Or if there's a misunderstanding about whether financial incentives are being provided in outcomes-based contracting. I'm just looking for some clarity around that.
We've had some good discussions with the team from the Provincial Auditor's Office about the working definition and what's meant by incentives. In other jurisdictions and in other types of human services, there is an emergence of incentives that are essentially bonus payments based on performance and specifically paying for results. In the marketplace of human services in Saskatchewan, there is not a large market of competition among community-based organizations. So it means that ministries need to work carefully to manage the change and transformation that's required so that service providers are prepared to evolve towards results-based services so that they have an invitation to be innovative in how they deliver the results, and that we don't, at the same time, destabilize the availability of services, particularly in small communities in rural and northern Saskatchewan. What's been an important consideration for the ministry during our own transition towards an outcomes-based lens is that we need to think very carefully about what progress looks like for our clients. We're working towards a client-focused approach. So where in the past we may have written contracts that were entirely focused on employment as a measure of success, the ministry has learned over time that employment is a significant win for those who are imminently employable, but often our work is for people who are distant from the labor market, and our job is to help them make progress in their own individual career plan from where they are to where they could be. And what we were finding is that in measuring success only based on employment, we were discounting the success that was taking place with some of our community partners, and we were disregarding the characteristics of the clients that we serve. The ministry supports a wide range of individuals, some who have very low levels of literacy and formal education, people with limited language skills as well, right through to higher skilled workers. And because of that, we've adopted an approach to define outcomes based on a person's career status. So we want to make sure that an individual arrives at our door with a clear assessment of what that status is. Some people will need some basic stability before they're prepared to participate in training or employment. And that would include things like housing, transportation, childcare. Those are legitimate obstacles to employment and training. We want to define that as a success in our contracts for the clients that need those things. Once you have that stable foundation, we want to make sure that you have a career plan and a career destiny that's outlined. We don't want to see people enrolling in training or education seats without purpose. Once you've got that guiding star in terms of your career direction, participation in education and training is the next milestone. So that's how we also define success and career progress. From there, it's graduating to jobs and keeping those jobs, and then laddering up. So we've segmented our client population based on some universal definitions of what employability looks like for anyone. It's independent of their demographic characteristics. What we're looking for is a system that helps people realize their full potential in the province, whether they have a disability or not, whether they're Indigenous or not, whether they're younger workers or experienced workers. We're trying to help them advance along that same career path. So that's why the outcomes framework is so transformational. The progress towards paying bonuses or paying specifically for results is something that the ministry is mindful of, but it's clear, given the segmentation of our client groups, that paying for those outcomes requires some very sophisticated analytics to calculate the cost and also the value of those milestones. And so we are some distance from being able to make those kinds of conversions, but we're mindful of the advice and the opportunity that incentives can offer the system.
Thank you. I was wondering if the provincial auditor wanted to weigh in at all on this discussion.
Sure. As the Deputy Minister appropriately discussed, like there's been lots of conversation on this, and I think part of it is that when we look at the guidance that the Ministry has said and the primary purpose, we wonder if everything's all lining up yet, and perhaps what it is it's a point in time as to where they're on that journey of really, I think, moving to outcome-based contracts. So they're using a label, but they're not there yet. And I think that's, part of, I think, where we're at is they're saying they're using outcome-based contracts. Their stated primary purpose is to improve client outcomes, which is great, and in the most effective and efficient and cost-effective manner. They also say that the agreed upon outcomes in a contract are to reflect the minimum performance the ministry will accept from a supplier. But yet at the same point in time, they get paid the full amount, even if they don't achieve the outcomes as yet. We do recognize, as the Deputy Minister framed, that this particular area where they're using these types of contracts, there is a limited number of suppliers. So maybe it's a case where, a full outcome-based contract isn't quite a fit in terms of the capital market. Because in essence, the financial incentives that are reflected in the status update, that's appropriate, but that's reflective of any contractual arrangement that you have within an organization. That's monitoring supplier performance and making sure that you only renew contracts with suppliers that have met your performance. So that financial incentive is frankly embedded in all of the contracts that the government undertakes, or should be embedded in all the contracts undertake, which is a very positive thing to do. And that's why as an office, when we do the procurement audits, we do look to see, are they monitoring supplier performance? And in this case, they are. They are monitoring supplier performance, which is a good and positive thing. So it's that journey of that label of outcome-based contracts with where they're at in that journey that perhaps we as an office are pausing on, and is, and is reflective in the recommendations and the status.
Thank you. In terms of the status update and the current status of this recommendation, then I suppose, would it be appropriate to say that, because I believe this is that is the self-evaluation of implemented, or is it implemented by the auditor? Let me just check here. Yeah, it is self-evaluated. So yeah, in the last auditor's report, it said it wasn't implemented. It's a self-evaluation of implemented. So I guess the question is, was that evaluation made because you have reconsidered the use of financial incentives, but aren't able to get to that area of the process yet, or what is the rationale there, I guess?
I think maybe to illustrate the opportunity that we have, we need to think very carefully about how we might pay for outcomes into the future and offer incentives. So the value of employment is inherently obvious, probably to everyone that's in the room. The cost of making a transition to employment will vary depending on the individual client. So someone who is highly skilled, highly educated, perhaps even has work experience, they need probably a very light touch in order to re-enter or enter the world of the labor market. Someone who's rather distant, however, who's never worked before, who has low education or has other obstacles, the value of that employment transition in terms of that individual and their household, also cost savings to other government human services, is significant. Some analytics are required in order for us to make progress in that area. We're mindful of the fact that service provider organizations, many of them are not-for-profits, In moving towards incentives and outcomes-based payments, we are transferring a risk to those organizations. Can they fully absorb those risks is really the question that's on the table. For someone to achieve success in a classroom or in the workplace, there's a whole bunch of contingencies that are outside the control of a nonprofit organization and any one ministry. So when I talk about things like childcare, transportation, housing, the conditions of the workplace, all of these are factors that determine the success of an individual. So the ministry has defined 3 customer groups, one of them being internal, the other being employers and industry, and the third being workers and job seekers themselves. In order for us to find success as a ministry, we need to line up our efforts and activities. To help an individual with a disability, for example, to succeed in the workforce, we can't just help that individual. We need to nurture the workplace and ensure that it's ready to be inclusive and accepting of someone based on their skills and strengths.
In terms of the client-focused approach you've been referring to, you've been identifying a number of different measures and outcomes that the ministry is focused on. Are those published in your annual plan, or where would one go to find that listing of what measures are being used to determine success?
That section of our work is an area where we've reported progress in the most recent audit, as a matter of fact. So we had some observations and recommendations related to using clearly defined and measurable outcomes in order to track in a quantifiable way the improvements that are taking place in the system. What the ministry had been doing is reviewing the outcome statements that we were using in our agreements. We provided more clear definitions where it was needed, and we improved our performance measurement standards and the indicators that are being used in our contracts. Through that, a supplier handbook, so for the service provider organizations, our staff training tools and our resources have been updated to reflect the revised outcomes and the performance measurement standards and metrics.
Thank you. The provincial auditor noted that the ministry is maybe a little fresh on using outcomes-based contracting. Are there any other contracts with the ministry that use outcomes-based contracting outside of the ABE contracts?
We're working towards an outcomes-based approach throughout our procurement activities. Our intent is to be specific about what government intends to receive as a result of tax dollar investments. Rather than being prescriptive about the services and programs, we want to have clearly defined results. What that means is that when we're posting a request for proposals and when we're looking to contract with community organizations, we're inviting their own creative solutions to some of the labor market challenges that are facing employers and job seekers in Saskatchewan. So the outcomes-based lens is what invites innovative solutions in this segment of the economy.
Thank you. So just in terms of, so the outcomes-based lens is a framework that the ministry is using, basically, that they're starting to use for considering all contracts. That's essentially what you're saying?
Well, even more, as a government, we're working to centralize a lot of our procurement activities. And so that is the spirit of procurement overall in the government these days.
On page 26 of Chapter 3, there was a significant variance between what was budgeted, it looks like 2.5 million, and spent 1.7 million. When we're looking at the 2015-2016 budget, I'm wondering if you can explain what that variance, why that variance?
The payments that are made to suppliers in the context of the audit are based on documented expenditures from that supplier. So when costs aren't quite in line with the negotiated amount, we're paying for what's actually reported and invoiced.
It also says that there were 21 outcome-based contracts for 2016, 2017. What was the spend for that fiscal year?
I don't have a full inventory of all of the contracted dollar amounts with me this morning. I can tell you that on an annual basis, the ministry will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 different contracts for community-based services, usually with nonprofit, community-based entities. When we're working with those organizations, we're trying to clearly define the results that we expect. And we've also been working with the federal government on an outcomes-based agenda. So when I mentioned earlier the labor market transfer agreements with the Government of Canada, the outcomes-based lens in this province helped to drive the evolution of those transfer agreements with Canada. Now, rather than having 5 different transfers with Canada, they've merged them into 2. And those 2 agreements have the same performance measurement framework as one another. And so it's helped to standardize the expectations between the federal government and the province, as well as the reporting cycle. The advantage of that administratively is it allows us to focus our work on delivering results rather than doing a lot of separate reporting on individual transfer agreements. I mention it because I think it shows the impact of the progress that's been made in this province at a national level.
Thank you. On page 28 of Chapter 3, it talks about an outside consultant that was used to develop a manual, the contract management manual, enhanced outcomes-based contracting for its staff, and then a later companion manual. Is this outside consultant still being utilized? Or was this sort of a one-time arrangement?
That contract itself has closed, but you'll see further into that same document references to the framework that was involved, and you'll see an illustration of the employability dimensions that are used as the foundation for our contracts.
Who was the consultant that was used in that case?
We worked with MNP.
Okay. And what was the cost of that contract?
I have that information with me this morning.
Is that something we could get to the committee? Okay. Thank you. That concludes my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thanks again for the questions. Thanks for the responses. Any other questions from committee members? Ms. Lambert.
Thank you. You had mentioned nonprofit organizations and the potential risk to them if you are expecting an outcomes-based quantitative model. Are we using any nonprofit organizations currently for literacy or language programs?
The majority of the service providers that we're working with are nonprofit organizations, and depending on the community, there may be one or there may be several of those organizations. In moving towards an outcomes-based contracting system with those organizations, what it allows us to do in larger centers is encourage a specialization with those organizations to deepen the collaboration across systems rather than the competition. And I think that that's an important consideration for our province. We make significant investments in human services already, and relative to other provinces and territories, among the highest investments in this area in Canada. So it's the coordination and accountability that's going to strengthen the performance of the human service system overall.
So for an example, in Saskatoon, for literacy or language, or can you give me an example of an organization that you have used in the past?
Absolutely. There's a number of providers that we would work in a community like Saskatoon. You would see some of the college systems participate in that area, but at the not-for-profit level, you would see agreements with organizations like Read Saskatoon.
Specifically thinking about, as I know they have a high success rate with their programs, and now also they've introduced financial literacy and having good success with that as well, not just in Saskatoon, but the outlying area. So wondered if they were on the radar. All right, thank you.
Any other questions? I just want to say I appreciate the time spent on talking a bit about the, I guess, the recommendation, but then also the complexity of and diversity of the province and how services are delivered, and of service providers and who those would be, and their how they respond to need, and then of course the individuals themselves, or the users, those entering in for service, and the dynamics within their own lives as well, and how going about the consideration of output-based contracts, you have to be very cautious in making sure you're understanding those complexities and what sort of outcomes and improvements are realistic. So there's a lot of context that you brought there, and I appreciate that thoughtfulness, to be honest, in going about it. And I'm glad that you've been back and forth working together on this file. I know I come out of education, and I know in education that's these debates can go really different ways, and you can, and not suggesting this was the auditor's recommendation, but you can pay for performance, say, on graduation out of schools, and you see different places in the United States go this way, and what you end up doing is having sort of this perverse incentive built in where you're just, supporting sort of those schools and those environments where rates are high and where external conditions aren't as challenging, and underfunding the circumstances or the schools that often need enhanced funding to overcome some of the challenges that folks are facing. So anyways, thanks very much for the conversation and the work on this front. I think we have 3 recommendations in Chapter 3. All of them have been implemented as reported here today, and I'd welcome a motion on that front. Ms. Lambert moves. All agreed? That's carried. We will move along to Chapters 16 and 29.
The Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, again, formerly the Ministry of the Economy at the time of our audit, is responsible for attracting immigrants to the province and for assisting and facilitating their settlement and integration into Saskatchewan communities and workplaces. The ability to understand and speak English is integral for immigrants to become self-sufficient in Saskatchewan. Chapter 16 of our 2017 report, Volume 1, on page 213 to 216, reports the results of our first follow-up on recommendations originally made in our 2015 audit of the Ministry's processes to coordinate English language programs. Chapter 29 of our 2017 report, Volume 1, on pages 293 to 296, reports the results of our second follow-up on these recommendations. At February 2019, the Ministry had implemented 3 of its 5 recommendations. Key improvements included obtaining information on federally funded programs to assist it in facilitating its own programs, setting and using targets to facilitate it to evaluate the success of its English language programs, signing agreements with regional colleges for the delivery of these programs. However, the Ministry needs to update its method to assess demand for provincially funded English language programs. The Ministry has started to update of its methodology for assessing demand for the program. It uses various data, such as immigration data and regional analysis. It is starting to include other variables in its methodology, such as number of students, During 2018-19, the ministry has signed agreements with 2 regional colleges to provide specific English language programming. And it also needs to assess whether regional colleges meet its expectations. As of February 2019, the ministry was starting to set out a review process that would include assessing whether a regional college meets the ministry's expectations when delivering English language programs. It expected to complete this review in September 2020 and include assessing whether regional colleges meet expectations. Without actively monitoring and assessing whether the program meets the ministry's expectations, it does not know if annual program funding achieves its expectations. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you for the presentation. I'll turn it over to the ministry, and then for brief remarks, then we'll open up for questions.
In the area of settlement, and specifically in English language programming, I think it's important for a context to be set. The Government of Canada makes significant investments in the area of immigrant recruitment, and their focus is primarily on those who are permanent residents of Canada. What that means in our province is that a system that relies heavily on the SINP program to support the attraction of immigrants, we see 7 out of 10 newcomers arrive to this province through the SINP. If they're being nominated with a job offer, they'll land in this province usually with a temporary work permit. They're not a permanent resident yet. So if that individual or their spouse or their youth or their children have needs, it's up to the provincial government to address those needs through things like language programs. Part of what we're working towards with the Government of Canada is encouraging more efficient processing of our nominations, because at times it can take 18 months or more from the time of nomination to the approval of someone's permanent residency. In the meantime, the provincial government is making investments on things like language programs. So that's why it's important that we synchronize our activities with the federal government in this space, and we start to harmonize our targets and try to leverage the investments from different orders of government.
Thanks so much for that. That context. We'll open it up for questions. Ms. Mowat.
Thank you for providing that background, and certainly there's a lot of coordination, as I understand it, that's required with the federal government on this. So I do have a couple of clarifying questions. In terms of accessing language courses, when we're talking about English language programs, can you provide an overview of what those programs are that are offered at the provincial level? I understand I've met a large number of people that take the LINC courses, Language Instructions to Newcomers of Canada, LINC, but I'm interested in whether these are the same or different, or there's overlap. Yeah.
So the LINC program that you referenced, that's federally funded. So that's mostly where the federal government is investing their language training dollars. Provincially, as Alistair described at the beginning, we do try to complement where the federal government is investing. So our programming looks a little bit different, but we are trying to support those who are not yet eligible for federal language training programming. So our investments provincially look a bit different. So we do try to also focus more on employment or English for employment, just given our mandate. And again, trying to complement what the federal government is doing, because they're really focused on LINC and supporting individuals that are in need of more basic or intermediate language training. So if you're familiar with the Canadian language benchmark system, they mostly invest in levels 1 to 4. So we also co-invest a little bit with them on the levels 1 to 4. But we also supplement that with programming for English for employment. We also provide funding for what we're calling conversation circles, which is really to support those that are employed and some outside of typical business hour opportunities to practice practice and work on their English. And then we've also worked in a few projects and with a few employers for at-work English, so trying to integrate language training in the workplace.
Thank you. In terms of, can you describe the time commitment of the English for Employment and conversation circles? Can you describe sort of what that looks like? I understand like the LINK courses are basically full-time English courses that folks take that really are quite immersive. So I'm just wondering in terms of the touch, what this looks like.
So some of the programming that we are funding is also essentially full-time, but the conversation circles, the at-work English, again, just going back to our previous conversation where we talk about our outcomes-based approach, we're not prescribing what the hours and what it needs to look like. So a few different contracts, it could look a little bit differently in terms of if it's evenings or mornings and if it's a couple hours a day or if it's an hour at the end of the day. So the idea is, and part of the objective and the interest and demand we heard is to have something that is more flexible. So again, to be able to accommodate those individuals that are working either part-time or full-time, obviously might also have family obligations. So we did procure specifically for something for options that would provide that flexibility. We also do fund online language training as well.
Thank you. And it certainly makes sense to be flexible. Some of the concerns that I've heard about the LINK courses are, you know, when can I make money? I don't want to go on social assistance and so on. I have to get my kids' lunch ready and things like that. So how do you make all of that work? In terms of the overall commitment from the province, what was the provincial funding allocation to both NGOs and regional colleges in 2017 and 2018?
I don't have those years specifically. I could speak to this year.
That would be great.
Okay, so for this year, for language training for the regional colleges, the investment is $542,000. And then I'll just have to do, I guess, some quick math here. But that would leave about, are you pulling out your computer or calculator? I'll get you a figure in just a second. So just to recap, $542,000 for language training for regional colleges, and $748,000 that would be going to mostly not-for-profits or other service providers for language training.
Thank you. In terms of non-government agencies that are providing these services, what communities offer them?
I don't have the full list off the top of my head. Obviously, we're trying to meet rural and urban demand. I can certainly follow up with that information to let you know where we have contracts in place. And like I mentioned, we do also fund the online language training, again, just recognizing that the physical opportunities or the reach is sometimes limited.
Thank you. In terms of the regional colleges, what regional colleges are you engaged with?
We are providing funding for language training to Carleton Trail, Cumberland, Great Plains, Northwest, Parkland, and Southeast colleges.
Thank you. You mentioned the online training as well. Is there an opportunity in that online language training for speaking as well as listening? I know one of the biggest things with developing languages is being able to speak the language. So I'm just curious about what that platform looks like.
So it's meant to look at reading, listening, comprehension, and speaking as well. So it does cover all of that, yeah.
And is there like, are there speaking coaches that are attached to it that are helping with speech development? Is it peer-based, or how does that work?
There is an instructor for some portions of the course, and that's where you get the practice with the speaking element.
And about how many individuals receive these provincial services every year?
So I have numbers for 2018-19, so last year's activities. For colleges, we had 672 students. For our other language training, so anything outside of the regional colleges, 1,004 students.
And would you say there was a marked change between last year and previous years, or are those pretty consistent numbers?
I don't have any other years with me, so I don't know off the top of my head. I can certainly follow up with that information. I think just in terms of the context that I'm familiar with and notionally, that we're starting to see more demand for the higher levels of language training, and that's really just driven by changes in national and provincial immigration programs and policies and requirements. So you're seeing in our provincial program more language requirements than there would have been, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So there's not too many pathways where somebody wouldn't need at least a Canadian language benchmark 4 to be eligible. And then nationally, if we look at federal immigration programs and policies, their language requirements have also increased significantly. So I think through that, you see that obviously impacts what kind of demand there is for language training. But for specific numbers, I can certainly follow up with that.
Thank you. In terms of being able to evaluate or assess the success of regional colleges in developing or delivering English programs, I know that in the status update, you're talking about piloting a new methodology for assessing program demand. In terms of the overall success of the program, how is that measured, though?
So the reporting and how we're measuring success, it's using a similar framework, or we're trying to move to the same framework that we're using with all of our other contracts and all of our other employment and career development related services. So using the framework of that employability dimensions. And obviously language training is not necessarily always going to lead directly to an outcome of employment. So we're working with the colleges and trying to get to a place where we're able to monitor and measure and understand the progress and how language training is supporting that progression for those individuals.
How has success been measured up to this point? So what did you do before, basically?
Well, I think when it comes to language training, some basic measures would be completion, and then the ability to progress to the next level of language training. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can speak briefly about the new methodology and how demand is going to be forecast with the regional colleges. It looks like the goal is to be able to forecast on a multi-year basis, which certainly makes sense in terms of planning. I'm sure the administration at regional colleges is more than interested in being able to plan beyond a year, beyond a year out. Can you speak to what the plan is to make that a reality?
A lot of what needs to take place in this area involves the coordination with the federal government so that we're better equipped to anticipate landings in Canada. I mentioned earlier that 7 out of 10 people are linked with the SINP program, 3 out of 10 are not. And their arrivals in Canada are one way for us to think about, when they might be ready to participate in language programs where it's necessary. The SINP itself has the opportunity to consider what language levels are necessary to compete for jobs in this province. And so that's another source of information for us to be able to think and plan ahead with our service partners.
Can you speak to the new methodology that was piloted in 2017? I just see it mentioned on the first page of the Chapter 29 status update here.
So there's a couple things that we've done and a couple ways we've made progress related to your question. So in 2017, what we'd actually done is launched or put out several requests for proposals related to English language training. So going out to the market to better understand what the demand is. And then most recently this year, with our funding for the regional colleges, we established a provincial average cost per training seat, essentially. So we were able to measure, bring together demand and capacity and create a bit more consistency around the province in terms of the allocation per regional college and have it be much more in line with actual demand.
Just in terms of the pilot, what lessons were learned in that situation, or what is being taken forward?
So I would say that the pilot is still ongoing. So the request for proposals, they just resulted in new agreements with new providers for new opportunities and new programs. So those would have just started in late 2017, early 2018. So most of those agreements were just finishing up year one, and many will be entering in or progressing into a year two. Okay. So still to be. Yeah.
Still working on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I believe that's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Good questions. Good. Thankful for the responses here as well. Any other questions on these chapters? We don't have any new recommendations here, so I would simply welcome a motion to conclude consideration of chapters 16 and 29, moved by Mr. Weeks. All agreed? That's carried. I'd like to thank the officials that have been with us here this morning. Thank you, Deputy Minister McFadden, and all the officials that are here, and all those others that would have been involved in the work on these recommendations and in the daily work, as well as all those stakeholders, including the not-for-profit organizations and the regional colleges that are involved in the delivery of this work every day. So thank you so very much for your time. Do you have brief remarks you'd like to offer before we shut down for lunch?
Only to thank the committee and the team at the Provincial Auditor's Office for their observations and questions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this time, we'll recess as a committee and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock with social services.